Hey everyone, I haven't made a video on this topic in about like 2 years, since around the time I started uploading Destiny 2 content to this channel, and so I wanted to make an update to optimal raid and dungeon DPS. I'm not going to focus so much on speedrunning this time around because ever since -5 became a thing in raids and dungeons, a lot of people haven't seriously solidified damage strategies for like about half the raids and dungeons in the game. So a lot of stuff has changed. I'm just going to go over what I would recommend that you use. I'll maybe mention kind of a reference to speedrunning if I think it's relevant, but for the most part we're going to be sticking to just what I recommend if you're like in an LFG or doing a raid or dungeon with friends, what I would recommend as like the meta for said raid and dungeon bosses. This time around I'm not going to go super detailed into the factors and variables that affect the raid and dungeon bosses. Most of those are still the same from the previous video from like 2 years ago, and the newer raids and dungeons, they're pretty straightforward, I would say, in what dictates what you should use for damage. And then finally the last thing is if I don't mention what a specific class should use in particular for a specific encounter, the baseline assumption is that Titan is on Curus or like Star Eater Eternal Thundercrash on Prismatic, you have Warlock on Star Eater Nova or Well with Sanguine, or you have Hunter with Celestial Nighthawk on Prismatic. So just so you know, if I don't mention any specific subclass or specific build for a class for a specific encounter, that is what I'm assuming is going to be the meta for that encounter. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and start with our first raid, which is going to be Last Wish. Now, a couple things have changed since we last made this video. Take and Spec is now gone from the game. Curses, so Riven's Curse Armor, is no longer obtainable on non-hunter classes, and Transcendent Blessings are still in the game, but I would say unless you're like a real tryhard or like a speedrunner, you don't really need to put any effort into getting Blessings or Curses. Our damage is more than good enough right now that even if you're in an LFG where people are struggling to carry their weight, you probably don't need to whip out the Blessing Curse Armor set, so I wouldn't worry about that too much for now. Now, the first boss we have on our list is Kalli, and Kalli and Shuro actually share the same Atheon model, which has a special separate entity hitbox as its head. And so any impact damage that is done to the head is doubled, including precision damage. So a lot of people are going to prefer using precision weapons on this encounter. Stuff that I would recommend personally is Izanagi's Burden, Still Hunt, and I would say heavy burst shotguns like Arcane Embrace are, I would say, a lot easier to use than slugs, and 4th times precision instrument is excellent on Arcane Embrace on a boss like this. Now, of course, you can opt to using slugs if you want. Celestial Nighthawk is, of course, a great option here. Having one tractor can be pretty helpful as well, and make sure you don't use Divinity on Atheon model bosses, as it overwrites that special head hitbox and just creates a normal crit the size of their basically entire body. So don't use Div, right? It actually decreases your damage output if you are using precision weapons. If for whatever reason you're using something like a rocket, it doesn't particularly matter. But I would say, yeah, most bosses you're going to be wanting to use a tractor on in this raid, and Kalli is not really an exception. The reason why I don't mention stuff like Whisper and Linears is it's a little bit overkill unless we get something like a Master Last Wish. And so most people will probably opt to be on something like a sword or on tractor, so that when they are moving from Kalli to Shuro, they don't have like no heavy ammo to move with. So that's why I recommend specifically special weapons, because they will still bake really fast if you're using the correct one. Shuro Chi is more of the same as Kalli, like I mentioned. The only difference is there's like ad clear phases between these 6 mini DPS phases, and so Tractor is even more relevant here because you can just boop the boss and she should move on before the debuff expires. Kind of perfect for this encounter, to be honest. The only things I would advise against in this encounter are, for example, like Still Hunt, because you're not going to have Cade's Retribution filled up all the way for every single break, and unless you coordinate with your team, like, you know, you do this one, you do this one, you do this one, it's going to be kind of awkward. You're going to have people overkilling that 1/6 because it is a hard gate after all. So I would just recommend using stuff like Izzy, you know, Slugs, Arcane Embrace. Heritage is really good for this encounter because you tend to get a lot of kills and, you know, stack up on recombination before you have to attack the boss every single time. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward encounter, very similar to Kalli. Morgeth is up next. Now, Morgeth and Riven share some similarities in that they both have intrinsic damage resistance against 3 weapon types: snipers, shotguns, and sleeper simulant. Now, sleeper simulant was meta at the time Last Wish came out, so I assume they just didn't want it like steamrolling the bosses. But regardless, this boss is kind of a pushover these days. He has the lowest health of any like proper raid boss, and so I just recommend bringing like Parasite, damage super, so like Star Eater Nova, Curus Thunder Crash, you know, Celestial Nighthawk, what have you. And yeah, just have some sort of weekend. You don't even need Tractor for this encounter, to be honest. Just have everyone on Parasite. Parasite, damage super, you know, make sure you have like a debuff grenade, withering gaze, concussive reload, whatever, and just nuke the boss. He falls over pretty quick if everyone just does that. Riven is the final boss of Last Wish that we have to talk about, And Riven has the same DR as Morgeth, but it's not really as problematic. I would say for the most part, the easiest options to use, even if they're not used in speedrunning, are going to be Microcosm. You just laser her mouth. You can use Prospector between her toes. You can heavy GL her mouth. I would say just avoid using heavy waveframes because they have fireteam scaling issues and don't have like the special bouncing interaction that they used to have if you shoot them above her arm. Finally, for damage supers, you can use the classic T-Crash Nova. If you're on Titan, I would actually recommend using Starry or Glacial Quake. You can just right-click spam right in front of one of her toenails, and it will do massive damage to her. But if you're going to use Nova Bomb, which is another popular pick, just make sure you Nova the side of her head rather than like her faceplate. You want to kind of Nova behind her faceplate so that the Seekers don't track to her eyes. And obviously stuff like Needle Storm, anything that generates projectiles, even stuff like Hellion and like Nanotech Tracer Rockets, those can all track her eyes. So just be aware of that. I would stick to using like Nova side of head, Glacial Quake on Titan or T-Crash, and then Celestial Nighthawk on Hunter. Garden of Salvation is our second raid up on the list, and it only has one relevant damage raid mod, and that's going to be Enhanced Relay Defender, which is only really used on Sanctified and not Consecrated. Now, for Consecrated Mind or Harpy, I would say, most people do just like push him off the map, and even in speedrunning, you do just push him off the map. But if you wanted to kill him like the proper non-cheese way or whatever, I would just use Whisper. Whisper is super easy. Just make sure you move past where the wall would spawn in while you're using Whisper. Just kind of walk forward slowly while shooting him, and you should be fine. Really easy to use Whisper on that boss even without div, although having a div is certainly not a horrible idea, given that I would say most new players, following him around with Tractor is kind of a bit awkward. So as long as you are using, something like Whisper and you don't use any projectile based damage, so heavy GLs will make the boss fly up in the sky if you're not careful, Wolf Packs will make him sway rapidly, Cataclysm Nova will make him sway, Needle Storm, Blade Barrage, any of that sort of stuff. If you want to use a damage super, stick to Curious T-Crash right as he breaks. You can use Nighthawk, obvious reasons, it's kind of like a weapon. And then you can use Vortex Nova if you want. People used to do that, or you could just be on Well. You could use Song of Flame maybe if you want to give yourself radiant for the whole time. But yeah, I would say just avoid using anything that spawns a bunch of projectiles that seek after the boss. The only exception is technically in speedrunning, people used to use rockets without Pack Hunter on this boss. So if that's something you want to try, that is an option. I tried out using like a Slideways Bait Apex on this boss. It felt decent. But if you want just a consistent, easy option that won't get yourself blown up, just use Whisper, or people are obviously pushing him off the map as well. With the return of Garden of Salvation with reprised weapons, I'm noticing a lot of low damage on Sanctified Mind, and I think this is easily fixable. Number one, a lot of people aren't used to the fact that damage starts as soon as that tether to the boss breaks. So if you're on tether team, haul ass to the relay to do damage as quickly as possible. Number two, a lot of traditional damage supers don't work on this guy. So if you're on Titan, I would honestly just run 5 relay defenders and run whatever kind of subclass you want, like Prismatic is probably best. And then on Hunter, 1 Celestial Nighthawk, 4 relay. And then on Warlock, you can either run 5 relay or you can run 4 relay plus 1 Sanguine for optimal damage. The other thing is that most people don't focus on using their weapons as much as they can. I would not cycle in abilities and damage over time stuff for the most part. Just make sure you're proccing bait and switch and spend as much of your damage phase as you can just dumping heavy GL, because the phase is really short, and the way to optimize doing the most damage is just by dumping as much heavy GL ammo as you can. Deep Stone Crypt is our third raid, and there's no really useful like boss damage raid mod, so let's get right into the first encounter, and that's going to be Crypt Security. Now, Crypt Security is going to present our first major departure from the last video's damage strategies, and that's because I'm going to wholeheartedly endorse Choir of One's Hipfire mode as the best fuse breaking strategy this game has ever seen. Now, if you guys are familiar, I used to recommend like Bastion, maybe Fourth Horseman, maybe like Wardcliff or Xeno. I would really just say if you don't have Choir of One, Xeno is like alright, but Choir of One, if you stand at the right distance, which is like maybe like 6 feet or so away from a fuse, and you just hip fire in the middle of the fuse, you don't even need a well or any sort of empowering buff. If you're at the right distance and you hit all the shots, it just one bursts the fuse. Super easy, leaves your heavy weapon open for ad clear, leaves your kinetic weapon open. Choir of One is obviously still a great and versatile weapon on its own. I do think it is just the best option, and we even use it in speedrunning because of how easy it is to use and how effective it is to be able to solo aside and just do fuse damage by yourself very quickly with Choir. So I'm going to really recommend Choir of One here, and I hope my endorsement speaks enough for it. Atraks, the second boss in the crypt, is kind of like Morgeth in that you kind of use the same weapons as like Parasite and a damage super. Just some reminders here, surges don't work on Atraks and neither do full debuffs. Void weakens and seasonal debuffs will work on Atraks. So what I would recommend doing is just you can have one guy on like an Empowering Rift or something like that, Everybody's on a damage super, everyone's on Parasite, you get 20 stacks, you weaken the boss with whatever you want. You can use GL debuff from this season, you can use a weaken grenade, you can use whatever you want. Weaken the boss, and then shoot Parasite, and then do your damage super. So Parasite T-Crash, Parasite Nova, Parasite, I guess on Hunter you could use like Nighthawk or Blade Barrage, doesn't really matter. But you know, you get my point. Should one floor Atraks very consistently. Thunder Crash buff means that Thunder Crash does a lot of damage to Atraks. You can 3-man 1/4 Atraks super easily with just the crashes by themselves, which is pretty crazy stuff. Taniks is a super stock standard boss, so I'm going to recommend a super stock standard damage option, and that's going to be just using Envious Bait and Switch heavy GLs. Pretty easy stuff. Use something like Bittersweet this season, damage super, throw on like Wither Horde and a Trace or something, 2 shotguns, 2, you know, Trace rifles. Doesn't really matter what you use, just proc bait, proc Envious, and you know, if everyone hits their shots and everyone hits their damage super, and you have maybe like a tether or a tractor or even just regular weaken and a well, should be super easy to destroy Taniks very easily. Speaking of stock standard bosses, next up in our raid list is Vaults of Glass. Now, Templar is kind of similar to Taniks, except obviously you have a relic holder. If your relic holder is a bit of a tryhard, you can definitely afford to get tractor procs off in between your TP blocks. However, it's not super necessary. This boss falls over pretty quickly, very low health on the raid boss scale with modern raids in consideration. In my opinion, the best damage options are probably just like heavy GLs like Taniks, or you can use Microcosm because this guy is really just not moving, super easy to get, easy crits, and just use a damage super, of course, as usual. The second and final boss of the Vault of Glass raid, we have Atheon. So Atheon has a special ability damage multiplier. He takes 3 times ability damage, and so specifically a lot of people like to use Verity's Brow fusion grenades if you're on Solar Warlock with Touch of Flame. This is best paired with weapons like Xenophage and Ariana's Vow. Ariana's Vow frees up your heavy weapon to be like a heavy gel or a rocket if you want to boost your damage a little bit between grenade throws. Otherwise, if you're on the other 2 classes, you can just do like heavy GL, Envious Bait and Switch, whatever, and just use like a damage super like Thunder Crash or like Blade Barrage or Nighthawk or really whatever you want. Tether is also a decent option on this boss because there are a lot of ads nearby that will die that will definitely extend the tether to the full duration of 30 seconds. Vow of the Disciple released with one of the most OP raid mods we've ever seen in the form of Into the Light, which gives insane grenade regen and damage output. Pairs great with the exotics like Verity, Starfire, and in some cases even Apotheosis. Now, for Caretaker specifically, the first boss in Vow, I want to clarify how the plates work. The second and third plates do not increase your damage output compared to the first plate, so there's no reason to delay your damage unless you're doing like Master or your team's damage is so bad that you can't break past the threshold on the first plate. So Caretaker's mechanics are similar to Atraks and Explicator in that he has a threshold. Once you cross the threshold, you have 5 seconds to overdamage, which means that you should save weapons like Parasite, Grand Overture, Horseman, Cascade Point GLs, and damage supers that have a lot of burst for when you cross the threshold. So if you and your team coordinate and you just save your Parasite, you save your burst for when you cross that threshold, you just do some chip damage, maybe some grenades, some special weapons until you reach that threshold, and then boom, you punch right through. That's the best way to consistently guarantee a 2-floor, even in LFG environments. It's very possible if people are just a little coordinated. I have found personally that it's even possible to just burst through right from the start of the threshold because Caretaker, honestly, with the power creep that we've experienced, doesn't have that much health. So if everybody just runs damage supers and just right off the bat you just dump into him, you should be able to get a fair chunk of damage out, and it's a lot simpler to explain that than to explain to LFGs, you know, hold your super and, you know, go when I tell you to, or like watch the threshold. So it's a little bit easier to maybe do that strategy. You can give that a try as well, but of course that's contingent on your damage being a little bit more powerful, even if the mental requirement is a little bit lesser. Rhulk is also an interesting raid boss, but for different reasons. He has very erratic attack patterns, and he will also try to aggressively kick you if he's not kept in check, which is why a lot of optimal teams will opt to have a tractor player tank the boss. So what this means is basically slapping on high resil, maybe solar resist, melee resist. You have maybe a well, healing rift with stag, healing grenades, etc, etc. And that way you have someone who is dedicated to giving the boss a full debuff while making sure that everyone else can basically hit an unmoving target that's just repeatedly slashing the person who is on tractor. Now, if possible on Rhulk, technically the optimal strategy is to do Verity fusion grenades while saving some scions beneath and going in and out of the arena's aura to shoot the scions to keep your stats stacks up, but in LFG situations and even in some coordinated scenarios, this can be kind of a difficult ask. So what I would recommend for most people is if you can have a tractor tank, heavy GL dumping is probably doable. Otherwise, if you have a div, options like Microcosm should provide enough damage output combined with these standard damage supers in order to one phase or comfortably two phase this boss in 2024. King's Fall is up next with the highest number of bosses in any raid. Warpriest is our first boss. There are no important raid mods in King's Fall either, so the only consideration here really is just going to be exchanging your brands. In my opinion, the best option is having your tractor player focused on getting knights. So your tractor player is going to get the first brand maybe, and then you have another player get the second brand. That way you lose as little damage as possible, because it is definitely possible to go kill the brand knight on tractor and come back and not lose any debuff uptime. So if you have a tractor player, just have them be on knights. If you plan on using rockets, you can have the galley player get knights as well. But for the most part, I would honestly just recommend having a tractor person get knights, and then everyone else can just be on whisper, because this boss has a huge head hitbox. He doesn't really flinch you that much, and you're not in a superb amount of danger, or you don't really need to move too much between damage. So I think whisper is probably the best option with some sort of special weapon to help you kill a brand knight, as obviously whisper is not optimal for that if you're close range. But besides that, yeah, just use whisper. It's pretty straightforward. Golgoroth is a bit more of a tricky one because he has a really large health pool like Warpriest, but he has a bit more annoying factors going on. For example, you have one person out of commission constantly because they're doing gaze. Sometimes his crit can be blocked by missiles, or he can be turned sideways even if your gaze person is doing their job properly. So it can be definitely kind of annoying to come up with a consistent damage strategy for Golgoroth. That being said, in my opinion, I think it's probably between Whisper, Microcosm with ability spam, or rockets and heavy jails if your team is a little bit more on the competent side when it comes to doing damage rotations. If your team is more of a 5 bubble or a 6 bubble or a 2-phase type of team, I think Whisper is definitely a decent option because you can take your time and just pace yourself in every bubble. Whereas if your team is a little bit more competent, you can have like a tractor be one of your gaze people, a galley person be another of your gaze people, and then try and use rockets and heavy jails to go for like a 3 bubble or a 4 bubble or something like that. Just make sure that you prioritize slow and consistent hits. The biggest mistake people make during Golgoroth is kind of rushing their damage and missing big chunks of it, like missing a Goldie on the crit, instead of just taking their time and making sure they hit their damage. Because remember, this damage phase is incredibly long. You get like over a minute of uptime if you use every bubble properly. Speaking of bubbles, it's wise to maybe run something like Bastion or some sort of fusion rifle. Obviously, those bubbles don't respond well to explosive damage, so anything that does high impact damage like Bastion, Choir Fusions is advised for an encounter like this. The third boss, or I should say bosses, in the King's Fall raid are of course the two daughters that come after Golgoroth, and these two are kind of a pushover. You only need to fight them one at a time as well. And so in my opinion, just dumping heavy jails is pretty easy. You don't really need a div. Even if they're kind of thin, they don't really sway too much on their platform. They tend to stay pretty still. So just kind of use like 2 splash damage weapons or 2 really easy to hit weapons like Witherhoard and a Trace or something. Use your Envious Arsenal, bait and switch GL, and like 2 mags from everyone plus maybe some damage supers, and you're pretty much set. You can even use Thunder Crash on them. It's not too hard. Tractor is not a horrible idea. You can have a floater kind of just run Tractor. Just make sure if you're going to use Tractor that you just jump straight up and straight down and you don't like accidentally go on their platform, because obviously you get booped off and you might die, so you want to avoid that. But besides that, yeah, daughter's damage is pretty straightforward, and the damage supers that you use are not really different from any other boss, and it's kind of just heavy jail dumping. Oryx is the final boss of the King's Fall raid, and it's hard not to recommend Whisper for this guy given how big his crit is and how little he moves. So if you want a simple option, Whisper is definitely still there. That being said, heavy jails will outdamage Whisper this season if you use them properly, and that's given that there's no Sniper's Meditation in the artifact anymore. That being said, your team will definitely find consistent success no matter what strategy you choose between the two. Now, when it comes to debuff, you can do like a standard debuff nade cycle, snare bomb cycle, withering gaze. You can use GL debuff from the seasonal mods. Any of that will be fine as well. If you have a player that is maybe on Titan, you can also Tractor Oryx as well. For those of you that don't know, it ends up working pretty well because you can Tractor when his hand slams down, and then you can do something like a T-Crash into his hand and then just do Tractor and like sniper swaps after that. Those of you who have seen the King's Fall world record probably know what I'm talking about, but for those of you that don't, I'll put a clip of it on the screen right now. But that is also an alternative that you should be aware of, given that tether is a bit awkward on Oryx. It's kind of hard to extend it on him, given that there's no ads that are near his actual body. And so yeah, Tractor is definitely a 30% debuff option on him if that's something that you and your team are willing to go for. Brood of Nightmares is our next raid, and it actually does have 2 raid mods that I think are potentially useful for boss DPS, Focus Light and Focus Darkness. Now the way these 2 mods work is after you receive the associated buff, you get 20 seconds of up to 20% weapon boost damage for Light, or 25% ability boost damage for Dark. Now the important thing to note here is that you don't lose this 20-second buff even after you lose that Light or Darkness buff, which means let's say you want to use Focus Light and the plate order is Dark, Light, Dark on Explicator, you can step in the Light pool and then go to the Dark pool and do damage, and this mod buff will still linger. So it's important to note that you can use these mods unconditionally even if the plate order is not in your favor. Now, Explicator in particular, I think the best weapon strategy is going to involve using Cascade Heavy GLs, or maybe a Prospector mag every plate is potentially useful as well. I haven't really tested it, but I do think that 6 Prospector shots should be a pretty decent option if you are not comfortable using Cascade Point, or you haven't used it before, or you don't have a good Cascade roll. I think Prospector mag every plate is potentially a decent substitute as well. Now, I will caution you against using certain damage supers on this boss because Explicator has one of the most time-sensitive phases in the game, and if you choose to use something like a Celestial Nighthawk, a lot of the time people get caught off guard, and by the time your super has entered its cast animation, he's already shifted and you started moving to the next plate and you're going to hit an immune. So what I would recommend doing is, especially supers like Nighthawk, try to pre-pop them in anticipation of crossing the threshold, and for stuff like Nova and Thunder Crash, definitely I would advise doing the same, even though it's not as big of a deal as Nighthawk. Nighthawk, it tends to instantly cause the Explicator to shift and start moving you towards the next plate. As for debuff, if you have a Tractor player that's competent and can do damage well with special weapons or abilities, then it's a fairly decent idea to have a single Tractor player that can debuff the boss. Otherwise, I would say just rely on 15% seasonal weakens so that everybody can use a legendary or exotic DPS heavy. Now, ironically, the final boss of Brood of Nightmares, Nezarec, is definitely easier to optimize a 1 phase for compared to Explicator, and you can actually save a light buff node in front of damage if you want to use Focus Light for your weapons, but most people don't really find that necessary. So in terms of damage, I would just recommend doing like Heavy GL Dump, kind of similar to Taniks. Just use your damage super right at the start, make sure you don't get suppressed. You can definitely have a Tractor user here. It's easier to do damage with Tractor on Nezarec compared to Explicator, so I think Tractor is a better option here. You can still definitely use Tether if your teammates leave ads alive and they kind of go into the Tether and extend its duration during damage, but I do think Tractor is the safer debuff option, and of course you are welcome to switch to a burst option like Fourth Horseman for Final Stand. Down to our last 2 raids, Crota's End is up next. Now, Crota's End doesn't actually have any useful raid mods for boss DPS, so I'm going to skip straight to boss number 1, which is Uriute. Now, Uriute's a little special amongst the raid bosses because it's the only one where I actually recommend that you use a divinity even if you're in an optimal fire team. And that's because Uriute has very fidgety, flighty movement as being the Deathsinger model. And so even if you're not using a precision weapon, even body shot weapons like rockets and heavy GLs have difficulties hitting her because they are projectile weapons after all. So on top of the div, what should the main damage users be using? In my opinion, I think Microcosm and Leviathan's Breath have both shown themselves to be fairly consistent options in this encounter with these standard damage supers, and if you're on Titan and you can afford to swap from Cuirass to Actium and you don't mind stacking ahead of damage, Grand Overture is a pretty good option as well. Now, if you're more of the optimal player, I would say with optimal teams, surrounded heavy GLs are pretty decent as well. You're constantly surrounded during Uriute because of the rapidly spawning ads, and I would say hitting her with a heavy GL as long as you have a div is not particularly difficult. I think everyone is familiar with what you're supposed to use on the namesake boss of Crota's End, Crota, the big guy himself, and that's because Crota has a special sword scaler which boosts sword damage by 35% compared to a normal raid boss. And so I'm just going to recommend the standard fanfare for sword damage in 2024 Destiny, Surrounded Bequest if you're near the top left and you're willing to keep the knights alive. You can use Whirlwind Blade or Chaos Reshape Summum Bonum if you have, one person using a wayframe and no one else. You can use Whirlwind Blade, Geodetic HSM, Double Perk Guillotine, whatever meta sword you're using doesn't really matter. Just make sure that you have someone on Ergo Sum providing Pack Hunter / Wolfpack rounds. Great bonus that we didn't have around the Crota launch. The damage supers can be kind of the usual stuff, Star Eater Nova, Nighthawk, whatever pleases you really. And I think a Tractor user is totally fine as long as they're comfortable doing ability damage or some sort of maybe trench shotgun damage. That's also a good idea as well. Lumina and Support Auto also do wonders on this boss. They're good for keeping your teammates alive as well. Finally, we come to our most recent raid, Salvation's Edge. Now, Salvation's Edge doesn't have any helpful raid mods, so like we did with Crota, let's skip straight to boss number 1, which is the Herald of Finality. Now, Herald, unfortunately, he doesn't have a sword scaler like Crota, but he is the other boss in the game that people tend to use swords on even in optimal scenarios. And that's because Herald is just kind of annoying, right? He teleports too much, and so projectile weapons tend to miss a lot, or he tends to teleport on top of you, and then you just blow yourself up. And so in my opinion, the safest option for Herald damage, even now that we're out of the sword season, Arch and Blade season, is just using swords. The same recommendations that I gave for Crota, minus the surrounded, because you're probably not going to be able to proc surrounded outside of Final Stand. So I would just recommend, you know, Ergo, Pack Hunter, and then just have other people use regular meta swords like Geodetic, It's Stared Back, double perk guillotine, etc, etc. Damage supers are the same, and I think having a tractor is a decent idea, but you can definitely get away with just using GL weaken or any other form of weaken with extension. The final boss on my list today is going to be, of course, the Witness. Now, the Witness has a very long engagement range as well as a very long phase duration for a typical raid boss, and so this is going to affect what I recommend for consistent damage on this boss. Now, the obvious answer this season is going to be Envious Arsenal heavy GLs with like your standard damage super. Obviously, if you're using Nova Bomb, please make sure you aim it at his face and not directly in front of everyone's shots. Pretty important. Whisper is still a fairly consistent option on this boss, believe it or not, as long as you are willing to stay kind of in the middle of the platform and you can read the boss's motions and do like the single jump to avoid his wave attack. If you're not like that practiced when it comes to avoiding witness attacks, maybe don't use Whisper. Still Hunt is still an option on Hunter, and rockets are still fairly decent on him because they're all basically guaranteed to hit, and you have a really long phase to get all your rockets out. But I do think the easiest option is probably going to be something like Cloud Strike heavy GL for most people, or Euphony heavy GL for most people, because heavy GLs are very easy to hit on him and they're very conducive to using them in team settings and kind of dodging attacks and kind of shooting in between your shots, and they don't lose a lot of damage for needing to move around and needing to dodge attacks. So yeah, that's going to be my recommendation for Witness damage. That's pretty much all I have to say about consistent damage options for each and every raid boss in Destiny 2 in 2024. I try not to focus too much on speedrunner optimization focused strategies this time around, because most people who are raiding with LFGs or even in more coordinated groups like with their friends or something generally are not operating under the same time constraints or like loadout constraints that speedrunners are. So I try to just focus on more consistent strategies that everybody can kind of use and have access to, with a sprinkle of some optimal options for those of you who want to squeeze out a little bit more damage for a little bit more effort on your part. So with that out of the way, the damage rotations that I'm testing for Season 25 for Revenant are almost all done. I'm just waiting for the November 19th update with Ignition and hopefully Shatter damage patch so that I can retest some of these options, these rotations, and have a conclusive, definitive say on what I think the best damage rotations are in Season 25. So I'm excited to present that to you guys. I'll make a dungeon version of this video in probably the next couple days while we wait for that patch. And yeah, enjoy Festival of the Lost while it's still here, and I'll see you guys when the patch hits.